Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Geoff Smith, and this is another in AbelCine's series called Creative Forces Online, which are interviews with filmmakers. And today we're very lucky to be joined by cinematographer Chris Teague and colorist Nat Jencks, who will discuss their experiences working together on the show Russian Doll, which is on Netflix, as well as how they got started in the industry, what inspires them in their careers, and kind of wherever the conversation takes us. So thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to introduce our moderator. You can't see him, but he's always there, Ian McCausland, also a camera technology specialist like myself at AbelCine.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, welcome to AbelCine's Creative Forces Online with our conversation with Chris Teague and Nat Jencks. So what I'll be doing is you have the opportunity as you watch this to send us questions. Please send questions for either Chris or Nat, and we'll be happy to pass those along. Thank you.
Excellent. So we'll introduce our two guests, and then we will visit with them briefly to say hi, and then we will look at a trailer from the program that we'll be talking about a lot today, Russian Doll. But starting off, Chris Teague is a cinematographer for features and television, and he was recently awarded an Emmy for his cinematography on this series. So welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Most recently, Chris shot 3 episodes of FX on Hulu limited series, Mrs. America, starring Cate Blanchett. 6 of the feature films Chris has photographed have premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. He was awarded Best Cinematography at the Tribeca Film Festival for his work on the feature drama Love After Love, starring Andie MacDowell, and that was shot on 16 millimeter. Chris graduated with an MFA in screenwriting and directing from Columbia, and has also written and directed several award-winning short films. And our second guest, Nat Jencks, has over 15 years of experience in post-production. His past projects range from studio features to indies and documentaries, and include work for directors such as Steven Soderbergh, whom some of you might have heard of, Michel Gondry, Spike Jonze, Todd Haynes, Barry Levinson, and many others. In addition to feature films, Nat enjoys working on music videos and has worked for bands such as Sigur Rós, The Dirty Projectors, Phantogram, MGMT, and many others. Nat has also taught classes on color and VFX, has guest lectured at SVA, Columbia, the local 700 Editors Guild, SMPTE, and many other institutions as well. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome.
Thanks. Awesome to be here.
Great. Well, before we dive in and hear about some background on you both, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at a trailer that we have queued up, or will momentarily, for Russian Doll. So whenever we're ready to take that, let's do it.
Let's fuck this party in the mouth.
Sweet birthday, baby!
No, life's short, carpe diem, etc., right?
What I do in my time is my business, my choice, baby! Sweet birthday, baby!
What was I just doing?
What? What do you mean?
I'm out of here. Fuck!
Sweet birthday, baby!
What is in this?
Stay away from me! I'm coming down the stairs! Hey, whoa!
Jesus fucking Christ, that's dark.
Are you gonna tell me what's going on?
I keep dying and reliving the same night.
Does it hurt?
Yes.
You seem fine.
I'm not fine. I'm questioning my own sanity. We gotta take the fire escape.
I have
Great.
a fire escape? I have to change my Airbnb listing then.
What was wrong with the stairs?
It's a long story involving multiple deaths.
Yeah, this is much safer.
I never lasted this long. Those things are a menace. I'm having a very hard, never-ending night. Do we know each other?
Fuck off!
Will you stop acting crazy? What are you doing?
Should I call my guy at Bellevue?
Is it the nicest psych ward?
It's definitely the closest one.
Hey, let me answer!
I look at you now, chasing down death at every corner, fighting your way to the light. Do you still have that in you?
I am not crazy. You know, I hate it. Some people call me crazy. Didn't you get the news? We're about to die.
It doesn't matter. I die all the time.
All right, fuck.
All right, thank you. Boy, that show really looks great, and we're going to dive into a ton of detail around that and get everyone's questions answered. But to start with, I thought we'd try to hear from each of our guests about kind of how do you go from however you started out to working on a big kind of major limited series for a major streaming concern like Netflix. And maybe we could start with Chris, if you'd like to take a few minutes and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll try to keep it brief, but I went to film school to get my graduate degree at Columbia, and actually went there to study screenwriting and directing. I had some background in film production. Before that, I had worked as an assistant to a documentary DP, and was a fairly tech-savvy person. And I went to Columbia because I knew that they were going to have a heavy focus on story and not so much on the tech side of things, and that's where I felt like I needed to develop my skills. And as I was there, I became, one of the handful of people who kind of knew how to use the camera and lights, and so got kind of pigeonholed as the school's DP. But fortunately, that led me to be able to shoot a lot of great short films, and that ended up going to Sundance, and then that turned into features, a lot of New York-based indie features, and luckily after about 10 of those, this production company, Jax Media, decided to take a chance on me, with another show that they had. And before that, I had been lucky enough to shoot a very small, I sort of eased into television, working on a few smaller projects. And this one was actually budget-wise not a huge show, but in terms of the ambition of it and the intended scale of it, it was much bigger than anything I had done before. And luckily, I had a good relationship with the production company. I knew some of the filmmakers involved. I had worked with some of the actors before, so there was just a few connections that helped me kind of get my foot in the door. And then, with TV, it's a lot about, you kind of, somebody signs off on you, and then you have to meet somebody else and
Right.
you interview with them, and then they have to sign off on you, and then the network has to sign off on you. So luckily, I kind of survived that whole process and was able to get here. But it was an exciting leap for me because stylistically, it was so much different than anything I had done before, and it's so often the case in this business where if you get known as the DP who shoots indie rom-coms, then those are the only scripts that you get sent. And while this is in some ways a comedy, it's such a different style, and it's so kind of absurdist. And I knew that when I first saw the pitch deck for the show, and that's what got me so excited, because I knew this was an opportunity to do something different visually, and to really get to try a lot of things that I hadn't been able to try before, because they just weren't appropriate for the material that I was working on.
Wow. And had you worked with Nat before?
Yeah, Nat and I have worked together for longer than I can remember. I was trying to remember the first movie we did, and I'm like drawing a blank. Nat, do you remember? Was it The Mend? Okay, I was going to say The Mend.
Yeah.
And gosh, when was that? That was like late 2000s. Was
Yeah.
what, 12, 13 years ago?
Something like that.
Yeah, and
Which might make a good segue to go over and hear a little from Nat about kind of how he got started and how you guys. I know it sounds like you had worked together before, but how you came to intersect on this project.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like Chris was saying, we've worked together for super, as long as I can remember, and a whole ton of features. I'm not sure, 5, 10, maybe more features. And like Chris, I won't get too deep into my background, but I didn't go to film school, but I did study computer science and art. So these things, didn't ever plan on being a colorist. At least certainly when I started doing this, I don't think very many people at all ever planned on being a colorist. It's such an obscure, sort of unknown thing. But I was always into photography and doing photochemical darkroom stuff was always like my favorite part of photography was always like being in the darkroom and like developing and stuff. And so it was a natural thing for me to fall into. And at a certain point when I was working for Steven Soderbergh, we ended up buying all of our own equipment to do the DIs for a film called Che. It was one of the early Red camera features, and so I had all the equipment at my disposal, and that provided an opportunity for me to really delve in, which is lucky because I'm not sure I would have ended up doing this if I had needed to, be an apprentice somewhere and kind of, I learn best just having something available to me to play around on. But yeah, I like Chris. I come from the background of feature films, and didn't actually ever think for a long time that I would have any interest in doing television. I think for a long time, television lacked a lot of, at least most television. There's the cinematic nature of things, like creating mood with the images, totally separate from story, was not as big of a piece of it. And so, through connection, the color was in television was really more just making sure that you can and read the image clearly, and the emotion is really driven by story 100%. Wasn't something that really interested me. And then obviously, like, as we all know, everything has changed in the last, 5 years-ish, more maybe. Where with episodic, there's, now huge opportunity to create mood and cinematic, to build emotion with images, and not just making things easy to see and telling the story, but also creating a mood and creating emotion. So now I've like really come full circle to some of my favorite projects that I've worked on, like Russian Doll, are episodic. So I don't that's kind of was an unexpected turn for me. But yes,
Nice.
Long story short, yeah, Chris and I had a long background together doing features, and then so it was a sort of natural transition, as he, and also lots of other feature DPs that I knew were all starting to go in this direction, where they were saying, "Oh, I have a Netflix show. I have a, here's this thing. I'm doing it, picking up an HBO thing." Like all of these little things. So it was a natural transition.
Nice. And did you work together at different stages of the project? Like, did you work together, say, during pre-production, or was the work mostly after principal photography?
Yeah, I mean, Nat's one of my first phone calls whenever I get hired on a project, and I feel strongly about bringing him in early on, and sometimes that's a challenge, particularly in TV, because you get hired on a show and you're coming on board with producers who have certain relationships with host houses or certain deals that they have worked out or whatever, and they feel like often there's this kind of education process that happens where I'm trying to show them that the colorist is not someone who just makes images match. That the colorist is one of my most important creative collaborators, and that's one of the reasons I love working with Nat so much, is that he really enjoys those conversations early on. When I'm telling him about the story and kind of my initial interpretation of it, and bouncing ideas off of him, and it just opens up a dialogue, and that's one of the kind of creative dialogue that you have when you're making movies and TVs is it's my favorite part of the process. So I always try to bring Nat on early and have this kind of dual conversation that's both a creative one and kind of big picture, maybe more intellectual one, and then one that's let's talk about all the kind of technical hurdles that we're going to have to jump through on this one, or let's talk about cameras and sensors and all that stuff, and it's been maybe it's been a few months since we've had a chance to work together, and new technology has come to light. Nat maybe has worked with something I haven't, or vice versa, and we get to kind of like share our notes on these different technologies and figure out if one of them might be a good fit for this project.
Awesome. And is that how the decision to finish the show in Dolby Vision came about, or was that something that was kind of like priced into the show before you came on board?
Yeah, that was an early mandate of the show, and it was the first time I had done that before. I believe, Nat, you had some experience with it at that point, right? And so you were kind of walking me through what you had done on it before, and all the different kind of possibilities or limitations with workflow that there might be doing HDR.
Yeah, I mean, when we first heard about the show, I think maybe they were on the fence about HDR, and then
because this is relatively early, I don't recall a lot of like a large volume of like Dolby Vision mastered, even limited series on streaming shows before this.
Yeah, I mean, and also, even more than now, very limited number of people having HDR TVs. So as it came up, at work, I had all the HDR gear and had done a lot of experimenting, and like, I was like rearing to go with this stuff. But in terms of like actually, seeing content, that was actually one of the first things that Chris and I did was, because I actually hadn't watched a lot of shows in HDR. So, and there weren't a ton, it was, the David Fincher stuff, and Godless, and a handful of shows. But we kind of got some beers, and
Nice.
and also Chris's gaffer and DIT also came in and
wow.
with us, just so we could all sit and just to get a sense of like, well, what even is this that we're talking about, and what how can we even have a conversation about this if we have not seen some things and have a meaningful opinion about what are things that we like about it, what are things that we hate about it, what are things that one show does better than another, all the things that you spend like decades forming opinions about with regular material, to sort of have a crash course of like, okay, let me start thinking about this. So watching that, and it was the first long form piece that I had done in HDR, which was really exciting for me, because I had been like probably for a year and a half, 2 years, been like sort of getting all geared up and like wanting to use this cool new technology, and then not really having a chance to.
Right.
Yeah.
It was great to have a chance for all four of us to kind of sit in one room and look at the same images together and just kind of react to what we were seeing. Because I remember, one of the issues with that technology is that we were not going to be able to monitor it on set, so we weren't going to really see what we were trying to shoot towards, and so we needed to, like Nat said, get up to speed really quickly and get a feel for what, how different is this really going to feel, and how much is it really going to impact the way we shoot versus the way we shoot an SDR production.
Nat, if I could ask you a question real quick. One of our viewers is asking, we just want to clarify, Chris, please interject when you want to. We're being asked specifically the primary grade, or not the primary, but the first grade you made for Netflix was done in HDR. And did you do an SDR version as well? And how did you go about doing the SDR grade?
So this was sort of an unusual show in terms of the workflow, because we really didn't want to have anyone other than, we didn't want to become distracted by the technology of it. And I think, Natasha and Leslie, again, we're really, we wanted to be able to spend the time in the color session focusing on creative choices or like driving the story, and not getting distracted by, multiple versions, HDR, SDR, and the differences. So early on, Natasha and Leslie said, like, well, how many people are going to be seeing this? And, agreed, like, let's just focus on one version. And they wanted to primarily focus on the SDR, because that's what, so many people would be seeing. And I would kind of handle the HDR, knowing that we were all on the same page aesthetically. And so we did a workflow where I was doing the SDR and HDR simultaneously. So as I would, on my desk would be a Sony X300, and I'm monitoring HDR, and then that's going through the Dolby Vision unit and creating a live down convert through, they call it the CMU. And then that's what Natasha and Leslie would be watching, so that I could do both simultaneously, but basically have them be one cohesive grade. And then, after the fact, I could always go and make trims. But the intention with this really was that I wanted the HDR and the SDR to feel stylistically really the same, and my hope was that feel like, oh wow, this has an extra intensity, but that someone wouldn't think that it was fundamentally different, and that once you settle into that world of watching something on a particular display, that it wouldn't be fundamentally different, and it didn't really need a separate grade per se. So yeah, and yes, on the technical level, yes, it was a Dolby Vision show, so the HDR is technically the master, and the SDR is the down convert. But I think philosophically, we didn't really quite think of it that way. If anything, they were sort of equals, or we weren't really thinking of them as separate elements, to be honest.
I remember, when you and I, because you and I did our kind of initial pass just alone before it was. Actually, I don't think I was ever in the room with Leslie and Natasha, because because of schedule. I think you and I spent a few evenings setting the look for the first, I think, 4 episodes, and then I had to leave. But I remember we primarily monitored in HDR when we were doing that grade. And I think our philosophy being, or maybe my philosophy being, I shot the show monitoring SDR. I have a sense of what that looks like. So let's really explore this technology and kind of dial that in, and then I remember, at the end of every session, we would look back at the SDR, and you get so used to the feel of HDR and the intense kind of contrast and color and everything, and it's sort of such a downer to go back to SDR. And you think, when you first see HDR, you're like, whoa, it's too much, we can't do that, and then you just get kind of seduced by it, and really grew to like it as we move forward.
That's interesting, and I feel like that really comes through in the look of the show, because I've watched it in both SDR and in HDR, and like I don't think you see that many HDR shows today that are kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they're going sort of in the direction of a sort of familiar film-like look. Is that fair to say that you were kind of after something that comes out of the tradition of film in terms of the look?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of working within that guideline, but also then knowing, we really wanted to explore rich color and high saturation, but to try to do it in such a way that it didn't feel too kind of plastic or too video-ish. So, that's where Nat comes in and is such a master at kind of shaping things like that. And that's kind of the general direction we're going in.
Chris, we're being asked what kind of camera you used for that show.
Yeah, so that was the red helium sensor, and that was a Nat suggestion too. We initially, my first round of tests was with a Vericam and a red with a Dragon sensor. And I mean, quite honestly, at that point, I wasn't fully up to speed on the differences with the sensor technologies. And I had owned a Red Scarlet, years before, and had the sense that there were these kind of incremental improvements. But then I had known that a lot of other great shows had used the Dragon sensor. And then, as we got just a few weeks out, Nat said you should really test the helium, and so we did that with our final kind of hair makeup camera test. We shot both Dragon versus helium, and I was super impressed with the look of it. And the other kind of thing that I learned from that is, I thought 8K resolution is overkill for delivering in 4K. I don't really quite see the point of it. And then I got to understand when I looked at the tests how just the kind of texture that you can get with oversampling and the way that you can shoot. You ended up shooting the whole show at 1600 ISO and sort of embracing trying to get some noise into the image, and the noise that you get created with an 8K image is different from the noise of a 6K or 4K image. And it was, at least it was to me, the way I kind of perceived it. It just felt like finer grained and less kind of blocky. And so that's kind of how we ended up using that camera.
And did you pair it, what was your choice in terms of lensing?
We shot with the Leica Summoluxes, which were I have almost exclusively before then shot with vintage lenses of some sort. When I'm using digital cameras, because of the way they kind of add some softness to the image. But I felt like this was a different. This show is a different animal, and I love the idea of having a lens that was very fast and could be shot wide open, and had this great kind of separation between foreground and background, and great color rendition, and it really didn't feel to me overly kind of tack sharp in a way that I have with other lenses, other contemporary lenses that I've tested.
Right. Yeah, and I could see that large aperture fast prime lenses like the Summolux is coming in handy, because there are a lot of really, in my opinion, super well done night exteriors, and maybe you could both talk about that from the perspective of shooting it and choosing how to expose it, and versus bringing that really rich, just very watchable, you don't miss anything in the night exteriors, which I often, especially in HDR, feel like I'm always halfway to grabbing the remote and raising the gamma or the shadow details somehow, but it's all like there. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the challenge with that technology, and then in this particular environment, shooting on New York City streets, for the most part, the challenge was having too much light to work with, and so a lot of times in the night work, where I still wanted to shoot wide open, I still wanted to shoot high ISO for the noise. We would be shooting with ND on the camera, a 3 or a 6, and that honestly introduced problems because it's something you never typically do, and you get all these reflections from street lights and things like that in the hitting the filters, and so we'd have to. It was a lot of work to kind of angle the filters to kind of get those weird, internal reflections out of the image, which is something I'd never come across before. So. That was the thing, and just in lighting in general, Tompkins Square Park is very well lit. So if you want to create contrast in it, the first thing we would do, and if you want to create get rid of the 1,000 shadows that you're dealing with because you have dozens and dozens of light sources, and the camera's so sensitive it can kind of pick up everything, and it's sometimes it wasn't until you did a rehearsal that you realize there's just the faintest camera shadow coming across the actor's face as the camera comes closer to them. So a lot of it became about trying to take light away from the foreground subjects and then introduce our own lights from the direction that we wanted or the quality that we wanted and try to kind of roughly match color. So it was rare that we had situations where we didn't have enough light, except for towards the very end of the shoot when we were almost kicked out of one of our main locations, this rooftop location that we had to return to that we had already shot several scenes at, Allen's rooftop. And at the last time we went there, we were not allowed to do any lighting there, almost no lighting. We could do some practical lighting on the rooftop itself, no lighting on the street, no units on the street. So, I mean, that's where I was so happy to have that camera and that lens package because we were shooting wide open at 3200, and what it can do also with the sky at night is really incredible. And the color kind of Nat was able to bring out of that these kind of bluish greens across the horizon of the night sky, the New York City night sky, I thought was really wonderful, and we were able to somehow make it seem like those scenes that we shot later with almost no lighting on the rooftop roughly correspond to the scenes that we shot, earlier in the series when we could actually do lighting when the location would allow it.
Right.
If I could, I'd like to change gears just for a second. Nat, we have a question for you. We have someone who's asking about the Sigur Rós video, Ruth music video. They're curious about the creative process that you put into that and how that worked out with the band in terms of their realization. I think specifically what they want to understand is how you achieved that very experimental look on that project.
It's funny that the video was a very long time ago. I don't know, that snuck into my bio line, but interestingly, I actually didn't really end up working with the band at all on that video. I just worked with the director and DP, and it's funny. It was a video that a DP that I've worked with for a long time, Zoe White, shot, and she's gone on to also work in television, just like she's shooting Handmaid's Tale and all sorts of amazing stuff now. In those days you're just like, I think we did that in my apartment, or actually I think we may have done it during a power. There was like a great giant power outage in New York, or maybe it was during Hurricane Sandy. I think it was during Sandy. But in any case, so the creative process on that was really more me and the director and DP, and that's generally been true of the music videos that I've done, is that which tend to be more experimental, and usually the director, DP have a vision and they're kind of given free rein to just do what they want, and the band will will usually take a peek at it. After we're done, maybe they'll have a couple notes, especially if they're videos that feature the band. Sometimes they have notes about, we want these different shots of us. But generally speaking, I don't actually have a huge amount of interaction with the bands. Typically, it's mostly DP and director for music videos.
Interesting. That's a good one. Another question I think is kind of aimed at both of you, and maybe we'll start with Chris. But I think a lot of people would like to know, HDR can be a little bit intimidating or potentially scary. Maybe not for you, but I think for a lot of us. And so we're all trying to reduce our uncertainty around it, because like you were saying, it's hard to pre-visualize it when you don't have these decades and decades of we've all watched, geologic amounts of SDR content, but comparatively small amounts of HDR content. And so you don't have that intuitive sense of what it might look like, after it goes through the process. So were there things that you decided to do differently, or tests that you ran that informed, did you find yourself exposing the camera differently than you normally would, or anything like that?
I mean, the short answer is no, we didn't. We like I said, we monitored an SDR. We had a Flanders monitor that had an HDR preview mode. So we had that on set, and I believe after a few days of shooting, we kind of all sat down and watched some dailies in that HDR preview mode, which I think Nat could probably chime in, but obviously it's probably not the best way to review HDR footage, but it's better than nothing. But I think our takeaway from that was, it's a bit different, but it's not night and day. It's not going to change the way we shoot light and shoot anything. And from what Nat and I had discussed is, there's even if something kind of comes in a way that's not particularly attractive in HDR, there's still the ability to kind of pull it back into something closer to an SDR range, or focus on the elements that you don't like in the image. And when I think back to the grade, when we were looking at stuff, there's a few scenarios that popped out in my mind that I kind of flagged as things to remember that did shift things in HDR. And one in particular is a shot that's in the trailer when Nadia is in the basement and everything's kind of bathed in this blue soft overhead light. And in SDR, I thought it looked really, really nice. I mean, really surreal in a great way, and kind of even soft top light. And when you got to HDR, you saw that the shift from kind of mid-tone to highlight, on the bridges of people's nose was very dramatic. So highlights on noses and foreheads, things that were kind of catching the light more directly, those went just very bright and were quite distracting for those particular shots. And then, obviously, like I said, we were able to kind of pull that back and, bring the kind of mid-tones a little bit closer to the highlights in those particular scenarios. And then on the flip side, some of the scenes with Nadia, some of the rare day exterior scenes in the show with Nadia walking down the street where we were shooting, in the shadow of a building or something, where it's generally kind of available light, but it's typically kind of a flat light where, in SDR it would just feel a little kind of blah, a little muddy, in HDR, just because it has so much more kind of pop and life, I really preferred the look of those kind of scenes in HDR. It just gave it more kind of energy, more life, and it felt more like the show.
Chris and Nat, we have a question for both of you respectively. Chris, I'll ask you your part first, and that is, we're getting a couple questions about your intent related to how you rated the camera. And in other words, you knew going in that you wanted to add that grainy kind of feel to it because it was proper to the look of the show. And the second part of this is going to be for Nat. How did you work with that when you got the footage? In other words, did you enhance it, do nothing, or did you have to address that in any way in your post?
I mean, for me, the adding the grain was another way to kind of soften the image, knowing that I wasn't going to have I wasn't necessarily going to use any softening filters, and that I was using contemporary lenses that were quite sharper than what I'm used to shooting, and a super high resolution camera. I felt like at least if we added some inherent noise in the image, it might help kind of knock down the sharpness a little bit. And also, in television, frankly, the DP just doesn't always have the kind of control that he or she might want. And as much as you can kind of bake into the image the look that you're after, you can, push, you can get that look in there without it being taken away, as opposed to, say, having a great conversation with the producers and creators about doing some kind of film grain approach, and then getting to the very end when everyone's seen the footage a million times without any grain on it, and they say, "Oh, this looks fine. Like let's leave." So it's just another way to kind of just try to bake in the look as much as possible, and that's another reason I love having a DIT on set, so that you can deliver a look that's as close to what you intend as possible, so that it can hopefully survive all the way through to the finish.
And then was there a part of that question that was specifically for Nat?
Yeah, I can respond to that a little bit. I think for almost for a lot of the work that I do, looking at grain and texture can be a big part of what I'm working on. I mean, usually we get it dialed in at the beginning, and that's something that we think about, and then it doesn't have to be such a day-to-day thing. But I do think that I love to have as much baked into the image as is possible. And even though from a technical level, yes, of course, you can add noise on later, and it becomes easier for things like VFX and whatnot to not have noise in the image. I just think that on a creative level, generally, things work so much more smoothly, and it makes so much more sense to have some of those creative discussions at the beginning, and then you kind of peel away different decisions as you go, and you don't have to be circling back, if that makes sense. So yeah, grain management is definitely something that in the grade is always something that I'm dealing with. Whether it's we have a VFX shot, so we need to remove the grain, then add it back in, or we have one shot that was shot with no light and another shot that was shot with more, and just matching them. But I think it was great to have. I was really impressed by the noise pattern on this camera, especially some of the early Red cameras had a very video-like noise, where it was sort of very pixely and filled with red and blue speckles and vertical streaking lines and stuff. You didn't want to underexpose those cameras too much. They worked best when you had a really clean image that was just exactly at exposure, and when you started to get to under, all sorts of weird stuff that was undesirable would kind of come to the surface. So it was really a treat to have something, that traditionally, I always thought that was one of the really nice things about the Alexa, is that you could underexpose it, and the noise pattern was very organic and filmic. And so this was one of the first projects that I had worked on a Red that had a lot of that same thing, where really Chris was super successful at using that in-camera texture that then, of course, we enhanced and stuff, and as part of the grade.
Wow.
The follow-up question to that for Chris and for Nat is, what was your reaction when you had that noise as part of the creative process and saw it in HDR versus SDR?
I don't remember feeling like there was a dramatic difference between HDR and SDR with the noise level. Do you, Nat? Do you remember noticing that?
No, I don't think so. I think for me, sort of subjectively feels the same. I think in HDR, all the little matching issues become much, what's just in the grade, all the little mismatches of everything from exposures to, oh, this A camera, highlight roll off is different, and all the little details just become a little bit more transparent. So I would say that I had to pay a little bit more attention to matching things like grain, where you just don't maybe feel it as much. But I don't think there was any type of sort of fundamental difference in it. I think it felt the same to me. It's just maybe more, just like everything in the image, just as it comes through a little bit more clearly, which is generally good. But when it comes to continuity and matching, can sometimes make something that feels like it's flowing very smoothly in SDR, and then when you see it in HDR, you're like, oh, right, okay, that one is a little bit sharper, or the grain structure is tighter, and then it gets a little blurrier, or whatever, But we didn't, certainly not any, felt the same, Yeah.
That's good to know, because I kind of was wondering that myself, that, would it sort of make it, would HDR make it so that that would be a choice that everybody would start making only in post, versus trying to get something organic that was, like you said, baked into the image? And
I have to say, the noise level, in my opinion, at 1600 ISO on the helium sensor is not. It's pretty minimal, and I would have considered shooting the whole show at 3200 if we didn't, with some of our tests, see some of the vertical banding that you'd see, at 1250 on like a Red 1 or something like that. There were occasional moments where that would pop up, and it kind of gave me pause. But I like the noise at 3200. I like, these cameras are so good nowadays. I think it can be very interesting when you stress them out.
nice. And so, somewhat related to that, did you find, like, Nat, were you, or both of you, were you taking advantage? Was the IPP2 kind of updated red image processing pipeline, was that a thing when this was shooting? And did you utilize it, or did you utilize ACES or some other like fundamental grading approach?
I could talk about that.
Yeah.
So that actually ties into something that's really important in the way that Chris and I work. And earlier Chris was talking about collaboration during pre-production, and that's something that's really, really important to me, as much as is humanly possible, to just get as much time in pre-production to build our look. And the IPP2 pipeline from Red is great. I've known Graham Natras at Red for a long time, and he's always been really helpful about trying to integrate the Red stuff into various other pipelines. But the IPP2 really makes it very easy, just it's a known published spec, so I can go from that to any color space I want. And so my pipeline just that I generally use is all built around Arilog C, so I can very easily move from the IPP2 pipeline into my own pipeline, and then use all the tools that I've built over the last 15 years of. So on this show, we knew we wanted some level of film emulation, and did a lot of testing with different film stocks, Fuji and Kodak, and then also non-film emulation and blending the two, and looking at one of the things that was really, really useful, I thought, is getting to do some tests actually with Natasha and hair and makeup. And that's something that is very rare for me. Usually we can get, the worst case scenario is like trying to build a LUT based on, just a shot of some AC at the camera checkout place, and then, but, a lot of times we can get a location that's similar, which is really great. But the best is like with the actual, if there's key talent, because we really for this show we knew that the way that the camera and the lighting, the color pipeline interacted with Natasha's skin tone and her hair color would be so.
And her wardrobe.
And her wardrobe, yes, exactly. So we ended up doing a fair amount of tweaking because some of the film emulation, that's kind of had a little bit too much of a sort of yellowy, jaundicey, not jaundicey, but a lot of traditional film emulation kind of steers a little bit towards more of a golden skin tones, and so yeah, it was really a treat to get to have a lot of testing time, both for the exteriors all around the Lower East Side, like nighttime exteriors, fluorescent lights and bodegas and stuff. And so skin tone and hair, because those are two of the things that really change quite dramatically between different film emulations and different color pipelines, is like, how they handle really extreme saturations and very wide gamut color and brightness. When you have something like, you're looking at a stoplight, does the center of the stoplight turn white, have that sort of coring, or does it stay red, and does it create weird artifacts? But then also the skin tone. So I think
that was another. It was just reminded me that was another great idea you had, is when we, that came out of those tests, is to shoot all our night exterior work with a daylight color balance, and that came out of seeing how the kind of color we got from sodium vapor lights, street lights, and knowing that we'd be spending a lot of time, under those lights for the course of this show, and so that had a huge impact. And obviously, it's raw, so you can do whatever you want, but exposing that way really helps the way, or setting the camera that way really helps inform how we lit those scenes.
We're getting
right. So just to follow up, just to be clear, that's something that doing this, like building a lot of the look in advance, is something that Chris and I have been doing for a long time, to varying degrees on different films, but always, at least like a half day to just take some time and so what we're talking about is like, building the look, and then it gets loaded in camera, and so what Chris is seeing in the viewfinder, what people are seeing in Video Village, what gets recorded into Dailies, everything all has our intended look on it. And then also, I think it's important for the gaffer and the lighting team to be able to light through the look that is going to be, if they're, especially these days with lights whose temp color can be adjusted, there's sometimes people are making fairly precise choices about, this blue light is working or it's not working. So it's important, I think, to get those decisions made, and then have the exposing and lighting and changing things through that work that we've done.
Chris, we're getting a question for you about how you go about creating your visual process for the look of a production. What sources do you go to, and how do you build a visual style?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess I could talk about this project specifically. there's a lot of gathering material from the other collaborators and then bringing your own stuff to the table. When I first interviewed for this, I put together my own little kind of pitch deck with a bunch of still photography, shot in New York City in the Lower East Side in the 70s and 80s that I thought was a great reference for kind of color and contrast and for a kind of gritty feel, but something with like a lot of lush color to it. And so sometimes it's kind of art references like that, which is nice because it's kind of a little bit separate from the film world. But then also, I get into looking at, you can feel free to kind of page through that if you want. That's kind of gives you a sense of the color, how early on we were kind of thinking about the color and the contrast there. And then I started talking with a production designer, Michael Bricker, and looked at his lookbook, and it was, the funny thing was is all our lookbooks were very much in the same universe. Like it really, I think that was a testament to the pilot script and how powerful it was and how much it got the just nailed a certain kind of tone. It's a lot of gathering material, and then it's trying to get as specific as possible. Sitting with the showrunner or the pilot director, watching scenes. When we see things that we like, maybe pausing the clip and starting to kind of deconstruct what we're looking at. And, is it the quality of light? Is it the direction of the light? Is it the color on the back wall that we really like? Is it that practical that just has a nice feel? Is it the angle of the camera? Because, when you're looking at an image, it can be so many different things. And one thing I think would be cool to bring up is that color patches document that I have there, which was specific to this show. This is a document I shared with Nat and my DIT, Jamie Chapin, and my gaffer, Joel Minnick. And basically, what I tried to do is take all these references, all these different images from movies and photography that we really liked, and take away the other image components of it and make it purely about one color, and just make it, and try to make it put it all on one page so we can see them side by side, and take that as a kind of jumping off point to say, like, this is the kind of, like, if you look at these images, this is the kind of saturation that we're after. That's, like I said, exists more in a kind of celluloid universe than in a digital video universe, and it's not something that's meant to be dogmatic, but it's meant to just start a conversation. And what my gaffer Joel did was, he took this document, and then he went through his RGB LED lights, and he basically did a custom kind of color match by eye to all these different tones. And then we had those that we could kind of pull out and try, and that's always a little bit like chasing your tail, because I feel like sometimes with LED lights, the color to your eye might look great, but to the camera with the LUT, it looks like something completely different. So, it's always a challenge to have so many different variables to work with. But that kind of gave us all an opportunity to get on the same page, and it gives everybody a chance to kind of react to that and then bring their own ideas to the table and kind of evolve the conversation.
Chris, you mentioned RGB LED fixtures. Did you have a standard kind of lighting package for this show, or did it vary based on, like you mentioned, the location had some restrictions on lighting?
Well, yeah, that one location did. We were using a lot of sky panels, but then, for bigger units, because they're just very versatile, they have the RGB aspect to them, but then also they're just quite powerful, and you can turn them into a really soft source really easily. The variability and the fact that they're wireless is incredible. But the other tool we used a lot were the Astera tubes, which, at that point, there was kind of version 1. But the ability to have something that was fully self-contained, battery operated, wirelessly controlled, that we could hide in so many different locations, and we could, often, sometimes without location permission, just tuck them around the corner of a building. You wouldn't have to be mounting anything to a building, or you could just be hiding it behind something. Or sometimes the great thing about those too is they essentially look like a fluorescent tube, so you can use them in shot. And they won't catch, they won't draw the eye or anything. So those were the main kind of RGB tools that we were working with.
Did you use those in like the bodega to swap for actual fluorescent lighting, like you might see in the?
If we had the budget, I would have, and we didn't, and we did not have the pre-rig time to do something like that. So that was basically what we ended up doing there was matching all the tubes and the overheads, pulling out a significant amount of them to try to create some shadow in there, and then gelling all the existing tubes in the in all the refrigeration units to kind of put the bodega into the Russian doll universe. And it was already like halfway there, and then we were a nudge, and then we accented with the stairs in a couple of places. I remember we hid some underneath the I forget, what it's called, the thing where you have like the deli counter with the lunch meat and all that, and we put some green Astera tubes up by the front windows, just kind of washing back into the bodega, just giving ourselves as many kind of opportunities with every direction we looked in to try to add some color or some shape with the lighting.
Excellent. Let's see, we have about a little under half an hour left. Are there any new questions that have come in? I mean, I'm sure there are, but any that you would like to highlight, Ian?
Yeah, a question for Nat. I think there's there's an interest in understanding the collaboration between you two guys. When you set the look, basically, is it correct to say that's sort of a show look or a show LUT that you've created, and then you're doing trims on that per scene when it comes back, the actual dailies come back?
So yeah, I guess just to be clear, yeah, that process is different for every show. But a lot of the films that Chris and I have worked on, and this is part of a function of us starting to work together when we're both working on extremely indie projects with no budgets, is that we've worked very frequently. We can become accustomed to a process where we're not really doing much dailies color, right? And that is something actually that I really love, even though you would think the opposite, right? I mean, that if the creative team can tolerate the little the inconsistencies and stuff that arise just in terms of normal practical shooting, I think that it can be really nice because means that when Chris and the team are reviewing things, they're seeing in a sense more the real image, right? So it's like if there's a moment where there's thinking like maybe that's a quarter stop over, and then maybe the next day they're making that adjustment, or if everything has the skin tones look really weird and green under that one light, that's they can sort of think like, of course these are all things that they would be seeing it on the day, but then to be able to see the dailies and make an adjustment, I think there's some benefit to it, I guess, is the long and the short of it. Of just doing like a one light dailies pass, and of course the DIT too is also doing very doing stuff on set and doing live grade with CDLs sometimes depending on the show, but when there is a DIT doing a live grade, that's actually really important to me to have a collaboration between me and them. It's Jamie Chapin, who's the DIT on this, is great and amazing, and we had a collaboration from the beginning, even just watching those HDR shows and talking about it, but also in terms of setting up the pipeline for the DIT to be doing live grades that are actually useful. which is, it's shocking to me how often that isn't done. And then, a lot of colorists, they know, will just, by default, just throw everything out because it's all, not done in the way that they would do it, and not always done in the best way. But so I think it's really useful and nice to include the DIT in that creative process, because a lot of times the DIT is, can be such a great piece of the whole puzzle, and be doing little adjustments that can actually then end up saving time, if they set up their pipeline the way that I do.
I think we're getting a couple of questions to that respect, and I think what the question is, in order for the DIT to sort of have that consistency, or for you to get consistency back, let's say, are you creating a cube file for them that they're importing into LiveGrade, and then they're adding the CDL to that and sending you back CDLs? And there's going to be some folks who think I just spoke Greek, so you might want to just explain what the cube file and the CDL are, so that they understand this creative process.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and explain it, but also without lingering on this so long that the people who aren't interested go to sleep. But yes, so generally speaking, we'll build a show LUT, and I think with Chris and I, we usually just do one show LUT, and we treat it like a film stock, and that's it. Maybe, in some situations we might do two, or some sort of very broad strokes thing, like, I don't know. There's like, if there's different storylines or something where something is warranted to have truly different looks, in the same types of situations where you would use two film stocks, but usually no different for exterior and interiors. We don't usually use like an exterior and interior LUT, and then we'll just consider it to be like a film stock, minus exterior, interior, and then the DIT will set up their pipeline. So I try and encourage the DIT to literally only use printer light offsets, which if the pipeline's set up correctly, with those being in front of, so they're working in the correct color space, printer light offsets should work very much like exposure, and create a very natural color temperature changes in exposure and also color temperature. And that really, in my opinion, is all that should be typically done in that dailies part. Like no adjustments to saturation, no adjustments to contrast, no pushing green into the shadows, and anything crazy like that. Just really just color temperature and exposure. And then, occasionally, sure, maybe you break the rule a little bit, and like if there's something's flaring a lot, sure, you could drive some contrast in, right? But generally speaking, keeping it simple really means that then I can immediately see when I get that stuff what was done, and chances are, if it's just a straight printer light offset, that's how my base grade works, so I can use that. Whereas if there's other stuff, someone's pushed in contrast, saturation, any type of weird split toning, I would never use that. So
interesting. And I wonder, so the dailies are coming in, and everybody's seeing them. Did you, at some point, knowing that this was going to be graded in HDR, start looking at some dailies or doing some temp grades into the Dolby Vision space? Or did you just sort of save that for the end and just decide to tackle it as a discrete?
No, I mean, it's always tricky with schedule, right? Like, because you're working on another show when this is shooting and everything. I mean, I was really excited about this, so I think I did load a couple of things. Had Jamie send me some shots and put it in to HDR just because I was excited to see it than anything else. And then I remember that, there were, of course, as there always are, a handful of things where, on set, they're like, oh, can you just check this? We're wondering, about, is this look weird? We're assuming that it can be fixed or not, or just, can you take a look at this? Those type of things, of course. Yeah, it wasn't any type of thing like monitoring it and checking it. And I think that kind of goes to your question earlier about like being afraid of HDR and worrying about it. Like do we need to be like every day going and reviewing it in HDR? Like, is it okay? And I guess everyone's shooting style is different, and it might be problematic if you were shooting and really making profound decisions only based on what you're seeing in the viewfinder, but
Right.
if you're like, not that Chris is not using the viewfinder, but from a more like traditional film background, you're making a combination of using the viewfinder and lighting things in a way that is going to look good, and metering and whatnot. I think there wasn't a lot of reason to think that if it looked good in SDR, it wasn't going to look good in HDR, and vice versa.
I think one thing that will come to mind, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Nat, is images, shots where you have a significant amount of the frame filled with a very bright object, whether that's a day exterior window or a lamp or something like that. Just knowing that when you get in the room and you look at an HDR image, just the pure intensity of the light emitted from the screen from those highlights can be really intense and distracting. And I know that was something we were concerned about in the beginning, and then kind of worried about it less. And again, like I said, there's the ability to control, to work with that in the grade. But I feel like that might be, if that ends up being kind of a motif for a project that you're doing or something, that would be something where I would start to get concerned. I think it's funny, it pops into my head, the opening shot of the series Glow season 1, which I didn't shoot, but I remember it's Alison Brie up against a glass, or not against, but with a glass window behind her filling the frame, and the Hollywood sign out of focus, and it's the entire frame is this bright daylit exterior. And I've always been curious, like, if is that like impossible to look at in HDR, like that kind of a frame, or would you just be able to tone it down later, or so that's one instance where I feel like I would think twice about it. And what do you think, Nat?
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I mean, for absolutely, definitely, there's things that we're just coming out of the camera, without controlling something. If you're monitoring SDR, you're not, just in terms of if you're using more practical lighting, sometimes there's something very bright in frame that is totally distracting that just wasn't, where it's like, there's a doorknob behind someone that just is like a little glint that's just like ridiculously bright. And same thing, I guess, too, with when I'm thinking about that, like one of the big things in HDR is the specular highlights, the little glinty, shiny pieces, just tending, unless out of the camera, they tend to be a little bit more noticeable unless you're managing that, which can occasionally make lighting feel a little bit more sourcey and fakey, depending on if the thing that's glinting is just a big film light, and what it's glinting off of a cup or a doorknob or whatever it is, then, if it's like a shine on a knife that's like part of the action, great. But if it's just like some random weird thing that's not at all intentional, then you have to take care in the grade to manage that. Again, I guess like what we're saying, like it is very possible in the grade to do that. And I always sort of fighting for people to not be afraid of HDR, in the sense that it really is like just a container for the image. And so if what someone wants is like, if someone comes in and says like, I just love the way that this looks in SDR, I hate it in HDR. You know, I can put an SDR image into HDR container and have it just look exactly like it would in SDR. You know, and occasionally they'll flag that in QC, and you have to explain that's your creative vision, not a technical error. You know, and I say that, and people find it comforting. And then when we go and look at it, and I can kind of have a slider and fade back and forth between, okay, here's an extreme HDR, here's medium, here's like the tasteful amount, here's SDR. You know, almost always they're like, oh, that's really the SDR? Like,
Right.
It looks almost like it's maybe a little broken. Like, are you sure that's the SDR? And it's like, yeah, no, that is it. You know, and so sometimes we'll just do like just a little bit of HDR, you know, just like letting the highlights breathe a tiny bit more than they are, you know. Or I've done project films where it was truly almost identical to the SDR, where we really just barely got into the additional headroom. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it, is that not that it has to be some different look, but it's like, you know, like it's like having a set of speakers that can be played louder, you know, without distorting. It doesn't mean that you need to play the music super loud. It just means that that dynamic range is there. If you want it, you can use it, you cannot. And it shouldn't twist anyone's arm creatively, or make anyone feel uncomfortable. It's just having the range to do it if you choose, you know, and assuming that everything is set up correctly. You know, of course, it's a lot more technical stuff to have to think about, and that's where, you know, hopefully someone is you know, just taking care of that, so that the creative team doesn't really need to be worrying about it and can almost not even think about it.
I remember, Chris, you saying that this show, it wasn't, maybe for either practicality or budget reasons, that you couldn't monitor in HDR. But I would imagine that you would do that maybe today, now that HDR is becoming more commonplace. Yes? No?
I mean, Nat, what's available? So when the last show that I had to deliver in HDR was season 3 of Glow. There wasn't a monitor out there for us to carry around on set. So I remember we bought and returned a consumer HDR TV to shoot some tests on to monitor, and you know, that's how we did our testing, and that was extremely, actually, for that. I'm glad I thought of that, because that's another circumstance where understanding what HDR does, or how you can use it to your advantage or not, is extremely important. And that's shooting on sets and working with translights, where you know, you're shooting basically a vinyl printed backdrop for your background out the window, and what you're kind of counting on in SDR is lighting that image for daytime interior sets, you know, bright enough so that the image is kind of almost blowing out and right next to falling apart. And that kind of tends to look natural to our eyes. It's what we're used to seeing. But, you know, when you're finishing in HDR, you can hold a lot more information in those highlights and a lot more color. And if you look at that image, you know, in that full kind of HDR container, it can look very strange and very fake. And so that was our big concern with our tests on that show, is trying to find the kind of sweet spot with the grade and also with our exposure. And we ended up kind of, it became, you know, it basically became like an IRE level that we were trying to hit, that, you know, I would have the DIT keep checking, you know, that we were kind of in that ballpark, and then, you know, that we felt good about that would translate well to HDR. But Nat, where are we with like production onset monitoring for HDR? Is it a possibility now, or?
Not great. I mean, I know I am in touch with the folks at Flanders and Sony all the time, and I know Sony is developing some stuff. You know, the challenge is just that for film, our industry of these professional products is so limited. You know, that the small scale. So you can get these cheap consumer TVs, but just on a practical level, it's a little goofy because generally the smallest sizes they have are 55 inches. So I think LG is making a 40-something inch display, but coming out soon. But so you have these like cheap, really cheap, consumer TVs that can do HDR, and then you get into like monitors that are, I don't know, $20,000 to $40,000. Even on bigger budget projects, it's a question of like, well, is that really the best way to spend $40,000? Or it's a rental, obviously, in those scenarios, but still, could there, it's a hard to think that that's the best way to spend the money, although it'll be amazing when there's lower cost monitoring alternatives, but then you kind of say, okay, yeah. So there are some, but I don't know a ton of shows that are putting like a Sony X300 or a Flanders 311 or something on set. The cheaper, a lot of DITs have the Flanders DM250, which is just a little 25-inch, and the HDR simulation mode is surprisingly good. We did some tests for this, and I have for other shows where we'll just put it up against the Sony X300, which is what I just have in my room, and come in and look at some stuff, and it just clips off the highlights, which sounds really, really terrible and like the absolute last thing you would ever want to be monitoring anything with. But in reality, it's not so bad because those are the specular highlights generally, and it's so good for getting us a sense of something. Not at all good for like judging. You can't use it for if you're judging if something's clipping or. But you wouldn't really want to be judging something like that visually anyway. You want to use a waveform or some sort of false color or something. I don't know. Yeah, I don't. It would be great if there are some HDR. And I think that's coming soon. Is small like 17-inch, 25-inch monitors that can do HDR. At an affordable price, but right now there's not a ton of options. So most people that
on the horizon, but yeah, nothing that's really here today. I guess one other question I had, and then we'll hear if anything else has popped up from the audience. But so let's say we do move into a world where we're monitoring HDR on set while we're shooting in HDR again, because if that's going to be the kind of the master that other deliverables are kind of downsampled from, how would you apply? So let's say you had the show LUT that was used in 709 on this show. Would you use a LUT for HDR, or would you use another type of transform, or like a DCTL or some other approach, or do LUTs exist for HDR?
Yeah, they do. And if you set the color pipeline up in a smart way or correctly, you really shouldn't have to do a ton to switch back and forth between HDR and SDR. There should be I work with a color scientist named Bill Feitner, who is amazing, Academy Award-winning color scientist and one of the pioneers of DI, and the stuff that he's developed, and I've worked with him for a long time, does a perceptual transform between the HDR and SDR. That's a really very excellent starting place. So that and similar conceptually to ACES. And so you absolutely shouldn't be doing like a whole nother color grade, like that like I know people that have done that, and like that sounds just like totally insane to me. Like that you would just do it once and then just switch the display over to HDR and then just start over again and just
expect that to work. So the aesthetic aspects of the look that you create are sort of divorced from the output transform, and you can change the output transform out from underneath it, and the look should stay relatively the same in both SDR and HDR. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, I mean, it gets sort of like into a more interesting philosophical conversation, which is that, obviously a lot of the film emulation transformers that we use were all built empirically by, passing film through the scanner and profiling the film data. You have all the different color chips, and then you measure it and you profile that film. And was all, done obviously in SDR, and as Kodak and Fuji were developing those, they certainly weren't imagining anything in HDR.
Right.
But so we're sort of in a world where we are still really fond of a lot of the ways that those things react, and the colorimetry and the way that they handle skin tones. But we're also then sort of expanding that into even separate from the whole HDR, SDR thing. I think that's true just generally. It's like, so we like a lot of pieces of film emulation, but it's really nice then to be able to say, like, okay, well, yeah, let's use that, but let's try and not have the skin tone be quite so orange,
Right.
Like, we like this film emulation, but geez, like sometimes the blue and the black, the cyan blacks is a little much, so let's pick and choose, So I think it's sort of fun to be in an era where we're not really just emulating the film, but we're sort of more just building something new. It's kind of
Right.
fun.
Yeah, and I think this show is a great example of that, in that it doesn't hit you over the head with the HDR effect. It just looks really, really good. And I think I show this, or I tell people to take a look at it to understand, like we were talking about earlier. It's like, HDR is not necessarily, it's not this like big obstacle to doing what you normally do. It's just the ability to go a little bit beyond and maybe, accept digital imaging for some of its own unique capabilities as it exists, rather than as a way to emulate the past as much, even though there are aspects of film that we all really love. But like, then maybe let's not have halation, because that's just kind of like this blurring of the chroma on, like, some high contrast edge or something like that. I don't know. That's very interesting. So thank you. I think we're running up against the end of the clock, but were there any last questions from the audience, Ian?
Sure. Nat, this is kind of a tough question to answer in a quick sentence. Aspiring colors wants to know, are there any reference materials you would recommend just to understand color theory, how to get better? I know colors is you have to do it.
I can do a quick answer to that, which is that I would not do any type of like online tutorial, anything crazy like that. Like, stay totally away from that. But I think like a fun. I actually think photography and just playing with your own images is great, because you have the time, but also I think it's fun to just watching movies, and actually, like, it's gotten a little harder to do screen captures these days, with all the digital rights management and copy protection and everything. But I just think just watching lots of movies and then grabbing screen captures when you can, and looking at them and thinking about them, and just sort of, I think, just getting in the habit of thinking about what you like about something and what you don't like about something, that would be my only piece of like sort of advice, and of course just doing it. But that I think is would be my like watching existing films be sort of the best way to exercise your mind on that. Yeah.
Chris, any anything to add along that line from your point of view as a DP?
No, I mean, I do think, getting your hands dirty is really the best way to kind of start to understand what you're doing and develop your own kind of taste, which I think is a really good point that Nat's trying to make, is that, you know, you want to really have a perspective, you know, and it's not just about learning all the techniques. It's about, you know, letting your taste kind of be your guide and push you in the right direction, or you know, giving you a kind of direction to go in, or something, you know, to react to, and so I think, you know, collecting images is great for that. Collecting a library, you know, what I've started to do is I have this little folder on my Files app on my phone. It's just called Things I Like, and it's anything I see, whether I snap a photo of a practical I think could be interesting to use in a movie, or a piece of architecture, or still from a movie, or anything really, and then it just becomes this little, like, almost this little notepad, this visual kind of notepad of things to kind of keep ideas to kind of keep in your head that you may never use, or may come in really handy sometime. Great. Well, I think that about does it for us. We'll end with one question, which is, a lot of us have some time on our hands these days, and are using this to maybe, create that visual notebook by watching lots of content. And I was just wondering, what, for each of you, if you could say maybe something that you've been watching recently, or something that stood out to you that you've enjoyed, whether it's something you worked on or not. I have to say, well, for one thing, I have a 6-week-old baby at my house, so I haven't been doing a whole lot of whole lot of that.
I understand.
But what I have been reading a novel, which I know is not visual at all, but I think actually in a way it really is, because it's been kind of exercising my brain in a different way, and reminding me of how storytelling can exist in different forms, and how I think some of the movies I really like feel more like novels in the way that they're paced out, or the way that they're written, or the way that they develop characters, and just getting back into reading a book, or listening to a book, because I do audiobooks a lot, has helped me. I think it'll help me revisit different aspects of my filmmaking.
Awesome. Thank you. Nat, any sage words of wisdom?
Sage words of wisdom. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting that Chris is talking about reading, because it is sort of like, we interact with generally I spend all day staring at screens,
Right.
You want to give your head some space to explore other things, and I'm not that great at that. I get away from my screen at work and then come home and like watch something on Netflix. Yeah, I think that is a fun. I don't have any particular references or films to pitch. Right. Well, I just watched Uncut Gems. It was great.
There you go.
A lot of other people agree. It's not my secret. But from a cinematography standpoint, also really fun.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. DP Chris Teague and colorist Nat Jencks, who worked together on, sounds like, many different shows over the years, but relatively recently on Russian Doll, which is on Netflix. It's well worth watching. Really, really well done. And, I won't say anything else about it other than I think it's great, and everybody should check it out. So for myself, Geoff Smith, and Ian McCausland, thank you very much for joining us. Ian, do you have any closing words?
Oh, thanks so much, guys, for being here, sharing your insights, and thanks everyone for watching. It's great to have this time together.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. All right, take care.
Bye.